Hey, Doug, would you pray for us? You mind?
Let's all pray. Father, we thank you for this time, this opportunity that we can come together with other Christians here at this local church, and we lift your name up at this time. We recognize your power, your majesty, in your position in heaven, and we thank you for the ability that you've given us to read your word and to learn and to discern and understand more about you. We ask that you be with Dan as he leads our thoughts as we study the Gospel of John. We thank you for giving us this Gospel, which is so different and unique from the other Gospels. And thank you for the perspective we can see in the life of Jesus through the lens of John. Bless us through the rest of this hour. All these things we ask in the name of Jesus.
Amen. Thank you, Doug. We're going to be beginning in verse 1 of chapter 5, John chapter 5, if you'd like to turn your Bibles there. Just by way of a little bit of review, remember at the end of chapter 4, Jesus went again to Cana of Galilee, where he originally made the water wine. Then when he came back, the man told him his son was sick, He was at the point of death. You could tell that he was possibly diverting Jesus from his intended journey or his intended way of doing things. Jesus simply said, "Go your way. Your son lives." And at that very hour, his servants told him that his son had recovered. And that again, it says in verse 54, is the second sign Jesus did when he had come out of Judea into Galilee. Starting in verse 1 of chapter 5, it says, after this, there was a feast of the Jews. What we'll do here, let's go ahead and read. I'm going to read the first 15 verses. We're going to cover this whole section in one, in one fell swoop, if you will. It says, after this, there was a feast of the Jews, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. Now there is in Jerusalem by the sheep gate a pool, which in Hebrew, Bethesda, which is called in Hebrew, Bethesda, having 5 porches. In these lay a great multitude of sick people, blind, lame, paralyzed, waiting for the moving of the water. For an angel went down at a certain time into the pool and stirred up the water. Then whoever stepped in first, after the stirring of the water, was made well of whatever disease he had. Now a certain man was there who had an infirmity 38 years. When Jesus saw him lying there, he knew that he already had been in that condition for a long time. He said to him, "Do you want to be made well?" The sick man answered him, "Sir, I have no man to put me into the pool when the water is stirred up. But while I am coming, another steps down before me." Jesus said to him, "Rise, take up your bed, and walk." And immediately the man was made well. He took up his bed, and he walked. And that day was the Sabbath. The Jews therefore said to him who was cured, "It is the Sabbath. It is not lawful for you to carry your bed." He answered them, "He who made me well said to me, 'Take up your bed and walk.'" Then they asked him, "Who is the man that said to you, 'Take up your bed and walk'?" But the one who was healed did not know who it was, for Jesus had withdrawn, a multitude being in that place. Afterward, Jesus found him in the temple and said to him, "See, you have been made well. Sin no more, lest a worse thing come upon you." The man departed and told the Jews that it was Jesus who had made him well. So going back to verse 1 of that section, it says, after this, there was a feast of the Jews. Now, we have no way of knowing how much time has passed since this second sign that Jesus did in Cana. But it says that Jesus went up to Jerusalem. Now, look at verse 2 because it's a little bit interesting. We don't see this often in the scriptures. It says, after this, in verse 1, there was a feast of the Jews. But in verse 2, it says, now there is in Jerusalem. So we have a change of tenses, right? We have one that's past tense and one, and the next verse is present tense. Why do you think this is happening here? Does anybody have any clue what John is doing? It's a hard question. I don't actually expect anybody to know this answer unless you've really studied this a lot. It seems that there are some, so we knew from the first class we had, when I did the introduction, that there have been some that have questioned when the book was written, when the Gospel of John was written. This was one of those reasons. This is the reason why people question this. Because he says here, there is in Jerusalem. What does that sound like to you? Does it sound like Jerusalem is in great shape and the temple is still standing and all is well? Well, if you believe that, like I do, that this book was actually written late in the first century, Jerusalem would not be in great shape. It might be in better shape now, but the temple was probably destroyed by this time. Now keep in mind, some people have a different point of view. Not everybody agrees on the date of this writing. But I call attention to this because John says there is in Jerusalem by the sheep gate a pool. Again, it sounds like Jerusalem is all well and good, right? Well, the reason, and I'm not going to tell you the reason why he says this. I think John said it because at the time of writing, that pool was there. Okay, that pool was still there. We have writings as late as the 2nd and 3rd centuries, from actually 3rd and 4th centuries. Pilgrims actually described it in their writings. This same pool with 5 porches. It had 4 porticos around it, or porches, and it had one in the middle. Now, there's 3 different documents that document this pool. One is called Origen, one is called Cyril of Jerusalem, and the other one is called the Bordeaux Pilgrim. These are 3rd and 4th century writings that confirm that this pool was still there. So that really is not a great argument if somebody wanted to use it to signify that John was written prior to the destruction of Jerusalem, okay, or the destruction of the temple. Any questions on that? Just a bit of history to start this chapter, because again, it's interesting that John changes tenses here. He says, there was a feast of the Jews. Oh, and by the way, this feast of the Jews, anybody know which feast it was? We kind of don't know. How many feasts were there? I raised my finger, so there were 3 feasts where the men had to travel to Jerusalem, right? What were they? There was the Passover, we know that. What else? Sorry? Feast of Tabernacles, yes. What was the 3rd one? Anybody know? Has 2 names. Feast of Weeks. Some people call it the Feast of Pentecost, okay? This is a Feast of Weeks. So very likely a year has not gone by since the first Passover that John mentions in chapter 2. The other thing is, John usually mentions the Passover by calling it the Passover. So this is probably either the Feast of Weeks, in fact, it's definitely either the Feast of Weeks or the Feast of Tabernacles. Okay? John just doesn't say which one it is. So in verse 3, we have this, the beginning of this account of this pool. It says, in these lay a great multitude of sick people. And it says at the end of that verse, waiting for the moving of the water. Anybody read any notes on this section at all? Do any research on this? Let me ask a kind of an interesting question here, okay? Does verse 4 sound like something we would generally read in the New Testament? An angel went down at a certain time into the pool and stirred up the water. Does that sound like typical New Testament language? It doesn't, does it? Very likely what this is. Now keep in mind, the very earliest manuscripts of John does not have this in it. It's not there. Verse 4, I think it's verse 4 and, yeah, it's the end of verse 3 and verse 4 is not in the original manuscripts. If you've ever read the King James or the American Standard Version doesn't even include these verses at all. And I study out of the American Standard Version, so it's missing these two, or at least a verse and a half. So this is not there because some people, in fact, most people think this was a bit of commentary that was added to John sometime later. And that's why the American Standard Version leaves it out completely, because it was not in the original manuscripts. And I believe we're safe probably to not give credence to it as anything other than commentary. Okay? Any questions on this? For an angel went down, again, verse 4, at a certain time into the pool and stirred up the water. Then whoever stepped in first after the stirring of the water was made well of whatever disease he had. So that brings us to verse 5. Yes. Correct. The water is stirred. And Eusebius actually documented that that pool was fed by runoff rainwater and by other drain pipes. So it was when that water would come down, it was kind of superstition that people believed an angel was stirring it up. But Eusebius later documented that actually that was runoff water that made that water stir up like that. And that's a good, and I think the second part of your question there, Daryl, is that in the original document? Yes, it is. Because the stirring of the water was in the original document. But it was the part about the angel stirring it up that was kind of the tall tale, if you will. Does that make sense? I can't tell you whether or not people were actually healed because we only have a certain amount of information here. I highly doubt it. You know, the question is, do people today believe if they go visit a TV evangelist that they've been healed? Sometimes they walk away thinking they've been healed, don't they? But it doesn't mean they've actually been healed. So, whatever we want to think about that, I can't prove either way if anybody was actually healed because the text just doesn't tell us. But Jesus comes along and asks this man, do you want to be made well? And he says, sir, I have no man to put me into the pool when the water is stirred up. This is verse 7. When the water is stirred up, but while I am coming, another steps down before me. So he had clearly given up after 38 years of having this infirmity. He had clearly given up. He wasn't even trying anymore. And you kind of feel bad for him, don't you? But Jesus said in verse 8, rise, take up your bed, and walk. And immediately the man was made well. He took up his bed and walked. Question for everybody. We have a lot of modern medical technology these days, don't we? If somebody's been blind or hasn't been able to see well for, let's say, 30 years, do they immediately get up and start going about their life if they're given some sight? Is that usually how it happens? No. In fact, at first, I've read accounts of this. At first, they're very scared because the world is not it's not how they used to know it. Everything is frightening because they're not used to seeing. This man, also, when someone gets, say, a replacement leg, do they immediately know how to walk on it? No, they don't. But with Jesus, the miracle happened instantaneously. He immediately picked up his bed and walked. Why do you think Jesus asked him to take up his bed? Yeah.
And the other thing, Jesus' healing is instantaneous, and so he's just said, you've been healed.
You don't need the bed there anymore, do you? Go somewhere else. Oh, he needs his bed and he has to take it, right? What do these beds look like? Anybody know what this bed looked like? Did it have a box springs and a mattress? And it didn't, did it? That would be silly because he couldn't carry that by himself. It's a little straw mat. It's really what it was. It's a little straw mat, which brings me to this question. What basis did the Jews in verse 10, it's the Sabbath, it is not lawful for you to carry your bed. What basis did they have to accuse him of this? Was he really doing something wrong?
He's not doing anything more wrong than kicking kernels of grain that you didn't fail to teach us. It's the same principle.
Same principle. He was doing very little, wasn't he? But for the sake of the study here, let's go over it real quick to Jeremiah chapter 17, if you've got your Old Testament with you. Jeremiah 17, starting in verse 21. Jeremiah 17, starting in verse 21. It says, thus says the Lord, take care for the sake of your lives, and do not bear a burden on the Sabbath day, or bring it in by the gates of Jerusalem. And do not carry a burden out of your houses on the Sabbath, or do any work, but keep the Sabbath day holy, as I commanded your fathers. We have an impasse here, don't we? There's a bit of a disagreement. Yeah, Tim.
Well, when you go back to the actual Torah, it does not have the sanction of not carrying anything. But you have the sanction of not working. And here, they were working on the Sabbath day. They were engaged in business. And I want to suggest that carrying the burden or doing any work were both tied together. They were doing something to be gainfully employed, makes them honoring God's will in the matter.
Yeah. Well, let's also go back a little further. Let's go to Nehemiah. Let's go to Nehemiah chapter 13. I'll just read it. You don't have to turn there. It says in Nehemiah 13, verse 19, as soon as it began to grow dark at the gates of Jerusalem before the Sabbath, remember, I commanded that the doors should be shut and gave orders that they should not be opened until after the Sabbath. And I stationed some of my servants at the gates that no load might be brought in on the Sabbath day. Couldn't carry anything on the Sabbath day. Yeah, so if we keep going, if we look at verse 20, then the merchants and sellers of all kinds of wares lodged outside Jerusalem once or twice.
That's what's going on. They're abusing they think they found a, oh, I can do this, it's okay. It's not okay.
Yeah. But do the Jews here have a basis for accusing this man of carrying a burden? Yes or no? Okay, we have no's and yeses. I actually say yes and no. I agree with both. I agree with everybody. No, here's why. Here's why. Let's look at what Jesus said. If Jesus told him in verse 11 to take up your bed and walk, he actually told him that in verse 8. Take up your bed and walk. Did Jesus misunderstand the Old Testament? I don't think so. In fact, I know he did not. So clearly here, if it's between the Jewish leaders and Jesus, I'm going with Jesus on this one, okay? So he told the man to take up his bed. He had a full understanding of the scriptures. The Jews did not, okay? Now the question is, where does this fall? Does this fall into the realm of tradition on the Jews' part? And what can we learn from that, if anything? Just a little application.
The law was there, but minutia like this was determined by rabbinical tradition. And so whether or not this would be determined to be a violation of the law, it came down on the tradition of the rabbis. But the major point here is another place where they accuse him of violating the Sabbath. He basically said, I'm the Lord of the Sabbath. You know, I can do anything I want
Right.
because those does not apply.
Sure. And if he in that same kind of realm, if he commanded this man to take his bed, he had the authority to take up his bed, didn't he? Now Jesus down in verse 14, if we skip down, he says, afterward Jesus found him in the temple and said to him, see, you have been made well. Sin no more, lest a worse thing come upon you. This is a really interesting verse. What does Jesus mean by this? Sin no more, lest a worse thing come upon you. What did he have? The man had an infirmity. What is, according to the Old Testament, and what we know generally about life, what is sickness? What's it the first stage of? It's first stage of death. What happened when man fell in the garden? We succumbed to death. We were no longer immortal. What is sickness the first stage of? It's the first stage of a dying world. Okay? Now let's look, and there's Old Testament basis for this. Let's go to Ezekiel 18. We all know this verse. Ezekiel 18 and verse 20. Whoever gets there first, go ahead and feel free to read that if you'd like to. The soul who sins shall die. Let's go to the next verse. Let's go to the next passage. Let's go to Leviticus 26, starting in verse 14. And I can get there really fast, and we'll start reading that. Okay? It says in Leviticus 26, starting in verse 14, "But if you will not listen to me and will not do all these commandments, if you spurn my statutes, and if your soul abhors my rules, so that you will not do all my commandments, but you break my covenant, then I will do this to you. I will visit you with panic, with wasting disease, and fever that consumes the eyes, and make the heart ache. You shall sow your seed in vain, for your enemies shall eat it." What is verse 16 saying that will happen for disobedience? Sickness, right? Let's turn to Deuteronomy chapter 28 for our final example. Deuteronomy chapter 28, starting in verse 15. We'll begin reading there. Deuteronomy 28, verse 15. It says, "But if you will not obey the voice of the Lord, your God, or be careful to do all his commandments and his statutes that I command you today, then all these curses shall come upon you and overtake you." Verse 16, "Cursed shall you be in the city, cursed shall you be in the field, cursed shall be your basket and your kneading bowl, cursed shall be the fruit of your womb, the fruit of your ground, the increase of your herds, and the young of your flock. Cursed shall you be when you come in, and cursed shall be when you go out. The Lord will send on you curses, confusion, and frustration in all that you undertake and do." Let's skip down to verse 21. "The Lord will make the pestilence stick to you until he has consumed you off the land that you are entering to take possession of it." Verse 22, "The Lord will strike you with" what? "Wasting disease and fever, inflammation, fiery heat, with drought, and blight with mildew. They shall pursue you until you perish." Kind of interesting, right? Jesus is telling this man, go and sin no more, or a worse thing might happen to you. Is there Old Testament basis for this? Yes, there is. We just read 3 instances. Questions or comments on this?
Well, the worst thing also could be the loss of his soul, because the sin no more, he didn't say just not sin at one time, but practice sin. And the Jews weren't supposed to practice. Those curses were a function of not doing God's will.
I'm glad you said that, Tim, because that was where I was going to go next. I didn't want to bring the eternal part of it up until after we covered that piece. But yes, you're right. The worst thing could be that he loses his soul for eternity. So it could have reference to a number of things. So finally in verse 15, it says, "The man departed and told the Jews that it was Jesus who made him well." They had first asked him who made him well. Now he goes back to the Jews and tells them. Why would he do that? It seems like that's kind of not a nice thing to do to the person who just healed you. This is an easy one. Who's got the answer? Why would he go back and tell the Jews?
Do you think he was honest when he said at first, I don't know who it was, but after seeing Jesus and the question that Jesus asked him, it said, well, this is the one who healed him. So
I think he was honest. I don't think he knew. John tells us he didn't know. Yeah, John tells us he didn't know. I believe he went back and told the Jews because he was in trouble with the Jews. They had remember, he was carrying his burden, right? He was carrying a bed. And they wanted to know who told him to do that. Either you did it of your own volition or somebody instructed you to do it. he probably went back and wanted to get them off of his back because he was in trouble with them. Now, or he could have just been wanting to share it. Yeah, Daryl. Right. It sounds like he's been begging for 38 years. Right. You're right, he has no authority, so it would have been easy for them to intimidate him. And they did it all the time, didn't they? Hey, Doug. Yeah. Well, according to Jeremiah 17, which we did not look at, this man had just committed a capital offense. If you look at Jeremiah 17:21, he was guilty. So it was easy to intimidate him. Yeah, Tim. Say that again. Yeah. Yeah, I think that was part of it as well. Because remember, Jesus, when he found him again, he was in the temple. So he was where he should have been. He was probably giving thanks for the healing. So back in we're going to try to move here into this next section. Starting in verse 16, it says, "For this reason the Jews persecuted Jesus." We're going to come back to this. "And they sought to kill him because he had done these things on the Sabbath. But Jesus answered them, 'My Father has been working until now, and I have been working.' Therefore the Jews sought all the more to kill him, because he not only broke the Sabbath, but also said that God was his Father, making himself equal with God. Then Jesus answered and said to them, 'Most assuredly I say to you, the Son of Man, or the Son, can do nothing of himself, but what he sees the Father do. For whatever he does, the Son does also in like manner. For the Father loves the Son and shows him all things that he himself does. He will show him greater works than these, that you may marvel. For as the Father raises the dead and gives life to them, even so the Son gives life to whom he will. For the Father judges no one, but has committed all judgment to the Son, that all should honor the Son just as they honor the Father. He who does not honor the Son does not honor the Father who sent him." This is heavy stuff. And this is some of what we get in John that we don't get in some of the other Gospels. And this is why I love the Gospel of John so much, because we get some of these extra details, extra sermons that Jesus preached. And really, this is a mini sermon here that he preaches to these Jewish leaders that were accusing him of breaking the Sabbath. But going back to 16, it says, "For this reason, the Jews persecuted Jesus." There's actually 3 reasons. These verses mention 2 why the Jews wanted to kill him. Well, What were the three reasons? The first two are obvious, and I think there's a third. What's the first one? Okay, yeah, that's the second one according to, in order, sure. But the first one was he had done these things on the Sabbath, so he broke the Sabbath. Second one, he made himself equal with God, but there was a third thing that they were upset about. It's how this whole thing started. He instructed this man to break the Sabbath. So he not only did these two things, but he also instructed somebody else to break the Sabbath. Okay? So there's these three reasons, but the foremost reason is, as Tim said, he puts himself on an equal plane with God. Jesus called God his own Father. He didn't say our Father, he said my Father. That's a no-no. Going to verse 19, skipping down, it says that the Jews sought all the more to kill him in 18. But going down to verse 19, it says, Jesus answered and said to them, most assuredly, I say to you, the Son can do nothing of himself, but what he sees the Father do. Whatever he does, the Son also does in like manner. What do you call this? And Tim, I'm going to ask a Tim Beaver question here. I'm going to pull something right out of the back of my mind and hope that you all know the answer to it. I love to kid Tim about this. This is really just a defense of monotheism. What's monotheism? Mono means what? One. One God. Okay, monotheism. Jesus is arguing that he and the Father are one. There's not many gods here. There's actually just one. He and the Father are the same. Jesus can do nothing if the Father does not approve of it. He really is explaining the perfect unity of the Father and the Son. Okay, any questions or comments?
Correct me if I'm wrong, but this is the first time in John that he really explicitly says what you just said, other than chapter 1, which is not Jesus talking.
Right.
So to me, this is almost teeing up what we're going to see throughout the rest of John, is this really strong connection between Jesus and the Father, which just causes everyone to go nuts. But to me, it's like this is one down to the heart and the essence of what John is trying to convey to us.
Yeah, exactly. That's a great point, Doug. Yeah, Tim.
You link that comment, John 1:1, the Word was God. What John's doing is building that very point.
Yeah.
From a different perspective, he's saying the same thing now in a very real way for the Jews to understand, for anybody to understand today.
Yeah. Thank you for that, Tim. So, skipping down here to verse 20, he says, for the Father loves the Son and shows him all things that he himself does. And he will show him greater works than these, that you may marvel. As the Father raises the dead and gives life to them, even so the Son gives life to whom he will. For the Father judges no one. Let's talk about this dead first, before we even go on. What is Jesus saying here? What does he have the power to do? He's telling us several things. Number one, what does he have the power to do? And he's telling them they're going to see it, by the way. He can raise the dead. He has the power to raise the dead. But he's also talking about this future event. He says in verse 22, the Father judges no one, but has committed all judgment to the Son, that all should honor the Son just as they honor the Father. He who does not honor the Son does not honor the Father who sent him. And we're going to get more into judgment. We got 5 more minutes. We may be able to get into that. But here, In verse 20 specifically, he mentions greater works than these that you will see. What does he mean by that? What are these greater works? We want to get a full understanding of what Jesus is saying. Yes, thank you, Don. That it's the next verse. Those are the greater works. Greater works than these that you may marvel, as the Father raises the dead and gives life to them, even so the Son gives life to whom he will. Now, any other questions about this section before we move on into 24? Verse 22 does, again, give us a little bit more specific information about how we should view Jesus. And that is as the judge. The Father has given all authority to judge to the Son. So on the judgment day, who are we going to be judged by? Jesus. Easy question, right? Okay. It says the Father judges no one, but has committed all judgment to the Son. Tim?
And then that boils down to, are you doing what he says or not? Because his word is the criteria by which we either believe or don't believe we're in the right relationship or not.
Right.
I think the other thing is there the absolute perfect harmony between God and Jesus and everything that Jesus does on earth. And the Jews, we can't argue with it, the Jews couldn't argue with it, but it just is, nothing's ever been witnessed before or after this in the history of mankind, this harmony,
Yeah.
purpose, and will.
And as in a general sense, when we're talking about harmony, in a general sense, you ever hear somebody say who doesn't maybe spend much time in the scriptures, or maybe they're just immature or new to the scriptures? They see a lot of differences, don't they, between the Old Testament and the New Testament. They're like, the Old Testament, all these things happened, and they don't happen in the New Testament. Well, what is Jesus saying here? Jesus saying is that the Old Testament is in perfect harmony with the New Testament. He is the fulfillment of that. Okay? There are no differences here. I think we can do a few more verses. Let's read a few more. It says in verse 24, most assuredly I say to you, he who hears my word and believes in him who sent me has everlasting life, and shall not come into judgment, but has passed from death into life. Most assuredly, I say to you, the hour is coming, and now is, when the dead will hear the voice of the Son of God, and those who hear will live. For as the Father has life in himself, he has granted the Son to have life in himself, and has given him authority to execute judgment also, because he is the Son of Man. Let's stop there, because I think this is all we're going to get to. What does Jesus mean here when he talks about the dead? He mentions in verse 25, the hour is coming and now is when the dead will hear the voice of the Son of God. Who are the dead? Dead in sin. Are they in the grave? Are they necessarily in the grave? Not necessarily. The people who are dead in sin. Now, in a minute, he talks about the people who are in the grave. But this is people who are spiritually dead. And he says, and now is. In other words, the dispensation is now. It's here. I'm here. I am here to fulfill the Old Testament. Everything you read, all of those prophecies, I'm here to fulfill that. And he says, they that hear will live. Now, this is called metonymy. Does anybody know what metonymy means? Metonymy is using a word like here to represent a bunch of things, okay? So in other words, they that hear will live. Do you only have to hear, or is there more to do? Right. Right. It's the and we'll read more of that throughout the New Testament, obviously, and that's not the subject of this class here. But again, Jesus is saying, them that hear, he uses that to represent everything that involves following me, okay? If you hear it and agree to do it, then you'll follow me completely. Right. Exactly, Daryl. And very likely here, at the end of this verse 27, what does he say? He uses a term that is just going to fly all over the Jews. Because he is what? The Son of Man. Oh, that means the Messiah. He can't be the Messiah, can he? And Tim, I know you know the answer to this question. What passage, what prophet is he specifically referencing here? Daniel. That's right, Daniel chapter 7. We always go back to Daniel chapter 7, and for good reason. I think he's definitely referring to Daniel chapter 7 here, calling himself the Son of Man. That's all we have time for. That's the second bell. Great class. Thank you, everybody. And we'll continue. Try to read through the rest of chapter 5 and into chapter 6 for Sunday, okay?